All right, I have officially wrapped up Chapter 5 in Fire in California's Ecosystems, which was about fire as an ecological process. And I'm now moving on to Chapter 6, which is Characterizing Fire Regimes. So, over the last week, I was talking a lot about fire regimes and how important they are to understanding the fire environment and how fire interacts with the ecosystem. And maybe the first thing I should do is just define what a fire regime is. Just the typical fire that you see within an area. And that's going to change based on the climate, based on the fuels that you have in that area, based on the topography. And there's 3 main categories that you'll break your fire regime into, with 7 different branches within those 3. So, how you would characterize your fire regime will come down to temporal, spatial, and magnitude. So time, space, and magnitude. Temporal can be split up into seasonality, what time of year it burns, and fire return interval, so the time between fires, whether it's 5 to 10 years or maybe 50 to 70 years, usually the distance in time between when you would have a fire. Then you have the spatial aspect, which is fire size, so how big your fire perimeters are, and then spatial complexity. So that talks about within that fire perimeter, maybe you have an unburned area, an area that burns with high severity, low severity, and the smaller those patches and mosaics are, the higher your spatial complexity. So that's temporal, spatial, and then magnitude is fire line intensity. You can just think of that as your flame lengths, or the amount of energy or heat coming off of the fire. Fire severity is our second one for magnitude. That's going to be more about the impact that the fire has on the vegetation, on life and property. So fire line intensity is more the behavior of the fire, and then fire severity is more the impacts of the fire on the environment and the animals or plants around it. And then finally you have fire type. And that's going to vary from surface fires, passive crown fires, active crown fires, independent crown fires. And with pretty much everything I named, you sometimes won't just have a clean cut, oh, in this place we have a fire return interval of 5 to 10 years that burns in the summer and is always high severity and has crown fires. Sometimes you can actually have a combination of multiple fire regimes. So maybe you have low intensity fires that come through at a very high frequency and low severity. So it's just kind of surface fires, but every maybe 10 years. But then every 50 years you have a massive crown fire come through with high intensity, high severity, and high plant mortality. And yeah, that would be almost like 2 different fire regimes in the same area. So it gets pretty complex, but it's very important to understand fire regimes because the fire in an ecosystem is actually part of the ecosystem. So just like the plants that you have in a specific area have evolved with the temperature in that area, the amount of precipitation in that area, the soil, all those different environmental factors. At least in California, fire actually is one of those environmental factors, and your plants will evolve with fire. So if you disrupt the natural fire regime, you disrupt that plant's natural environment, and that can disrupt the plant's life cycle. So it's almost the same as maybe a plant is used to getting 20 inches of rain per year. And then all of a sudden it doesn't have any rain for a decade, that plant's probably going to die. But it's actually the exact same kind of thing with fire. So maybe a plant is used to fire every 10 years. If it doesn't have it for 50 years, that can actually kill the plant too, because maybe it needs the fire to reproduce. Or maybe it needs the fire to clear out competing fuels in order for its seeds to be able to sprout and actually prosper. So fire, just as much a part of the environment as temperature, wind, humidity, rainfall, soil. So that's the key idea there. It's not some separate thing that disrupts the environment. It is the environment. So that's kind of laying the groundwork. That's everything I learned in chapter 5 in a much more concise form. If you want more detail in that, you can watch my last 5 videos. But I wanted to set the foundation there because you may have had a question popping up into your head. And I had this question popping up into my head when I was reading chapter 5, which is, okay, so it's important to understand things like fire return interval or fire size or what kind of fires burned in the past or how severe the fires were in the past. Because then if we're trying to bring fire back into the ecosystem now, so to just try to make the California ecosystem more natural, we want to make sure we're doing it in the right way and in a way that is actually in alignment with the way those plants in that specific area have evolved. So in order to do that, we have to understand the fire regime. But then the main question that pops up is, well, how do we understand fire regimes? How do we look back in time and try to figure out what kind of fires were happening? And that is what chapter 6 is all about. And I just read the first section. It is about sedimentary charcoal and pollen deposits. So I briefly read one thing. I think it's going to get into this later in the chapter, but the first one that's pretty obvious would be your tree rings. So there's a lot of trees that won't die if a fire comes through, but it may leave a little fire scar within those little timestamps within the tree core. And then that's almost like a perfect timeline. So that'd be a good way to figure out your fire return interval. On the scale of maybe hundreds of years, I think some redwoods can maybe live 2,000 years. I've been to the Henry Cowles State Park, and I believe they have one trunk of a redwood tree that dates back more than 2,000 years. So in there, you can imagine, you could see maybe where those little burn scars would be, and then you can count back in the layers of time, and you'd be able to figure out the fire return interval. So that actually wasn't something that I just really read too much about. That was a passing sentence, but I've heard that idea before, and I just think that's pretty interesting and a perfect example of one tool that could be used. But let's say you want to look back even farther than 2,000 years. I believe it'd be further than 2,000 years if you're talking about time. Farther is about physical distance, pretty sure. Grammar. So that's where things like sedimentary charcoal and pollen can come in. So you imagine a big fire burns in the environment, and then you have all of this charcoal on the landscape because you're not going to have complete combustion where everything just burns. You're going to have some remaining deposits of the parts of the plants that only maybe partially burn, and you call that charcoal. And then what happens is you maybe have some wind come through, some rain come through, and it's going to wash all that charcoal down into some of your water sources. Like a lake bed is one of the best sources to find these deposits. So your charcoal washes down from the mountains that just had the fire, settles down into the lake bed bottom, and then it has a little layer. And then the next year, maybe there's no fire, but you still get some dust on top or some dirt. That settles on top. The next year, more settling on top. And just like in the tree rings, you end up with this timeline of soil, charcoal, and pollen deposits across time. So pollen, you can imagine how that works too. The wind just picks up the pollen from your plants, and then that settles down into the lake bed as well. So from that, you'd be able to take some cores of your lake bed, and obviously the deeper down you go, the further back in time you go. And the estimate that it threw out there is that we have the potential to look back 21,000 years. And the way they do this gets a bit out of my depth. I think that's the right phrase. But it's how they actually date it. It's things like mass spectrometry. Probably not saying that right. That used to be a word that they would use in the show Bones I used to watch back in the day. Mass spectrometer. So mass spectrometry, that's it. Or radiocarbon dating of isotopes. And they use some wild science to basically be able to date the isotopes in these layers to figure out the relative year that it occurred in. So then you can actually figure out what that timeline is. Then you can imagine what they do from there. They see where the charcoal deposits are. That will tell you where you had your big fire events in the past. And then that can give you a relative estimate of your fire return interval. Now, obviously, it's not perfect because it's hard to say if that charcoal deposit was from multiple fires or just one really big fire. But it's better than nothing. And overall, it does correlate with some things we know about climate. So during the medieval warm period, which I believe was about 900 years ago to 750 years ago, you see more charcoal deposits because if it's warmer and drier, you typically would have more fires. And then during the Little Ice Age, which I believe was 500 to 300 years ago, there's less charcoal deposits. So your fire return intervals, the amount of time between those charcoal layers, would decrease. Now, where the pollen comes in is from the pollen, you can, this is a pretty cool science. From the pollen, you know what kind of genus or species that pollen comes from, so what kind of plant produces that pollen. And then you can actually try to map out what the plants were like in that environment at the time. So you not only get a timeline of fire, but you can almost get a timeline of the ecosystem too. Now, obviously, there's limitations to this, but it's some of the best sources and data that we have to go off of. So then based on that, you can make different inferences about what kind of plants lead to what kind of fire return intervals, and then you could think about what kind of plants we have right now or what kind of plants we're expecting to have in the future, and then maybe how that could change fire behavior right now or in the future. Lots of different things that you can learn from this kind of research. So that's kind of the introduction, setting the stage for the rest of this chapter. We're going to go into a lot more of the different ways that we figure out the various fire regimes within an area, because as I talked about over this entire last week, it is one of the most important things to understand if you actually want to help bring Californians back into kind of balance with nature and bring our ecosystem back into balance with fire. One of the biggest things is to understand fire regimes. And that's what chapter 5 was really about. But now we have to answer the question, well, how do we understand it? Because we don't want to just kind of take the word and just assume that what we hear is correct. It's good to dig into the details a little bit to actually figure out where this data and where this information is coming from. And that's where we get into things like sedimentary, pollen, and charcoal deposits, which honestly I think is pretty interesting. And I believe I've seen this before on the Central Coast. I was on a beach where it's one of those rocks that looks like it's very layered, and you could actually see, maybe, I should have counted it at the time. I remember where this was. Maybe I'll go back there and take a video or something. But you could see the little black lines where you had charcoal fill in. So you can just imagine if I counted that, pretty sure I'd be able to figure out what the fire return interval was. And that has all kinds of different implications when it comes to land management, but not going to go into that throughout the course of this video. I want to keep this one nice and concise because there's a lot more to talk about throughout the rest of this week. So if you want to stay tuned for that, you can continue watching as I make my way through fire in California's ecosystems, and hope you have a great day. Thanks for watching.